They say some houses remember what others forget, that their walls, though worn and weathered, still hold the sounds of voices long gone, of footsteps that never came back down the stairs. And in Madison County, Iowa, there's one house that remembers everything. Just off Old Mill Road, tucked between the tall corn stalks and a row of forgotten cottonwoods, stands a crumbling white farmhouse, its paint peeled by 18 winters, its shutters twisted in place like a face mid-scream. For years drivers passed by it, with a strange unease, slowing down, rolling up windows, locking doors they didn't remember unlocking. But no one stopped, because they all knew the story. Or rather, they thought they did. Fade in ambient wind. Distant crows. The house belonged to a couple no one really knew not before they came, and certainly not after they vanished. Emily and Mark Anderson. That was their name. They moved in during the spring of 2005. She was 29, he was 34. No kids. No pets. Just 2 moving trucks, 1 tan pickup, and a dream of starting over away from the noise, the bills, the grind of Des Moines city life. She worked as a veterinary assistant. He did something with computers. That's what the neighbor remembered. Not much else. The neighbor's name was Helen. She lived a mile down the dirt road, across from a feedlot. Said she brought them a pie the second day they moved in. Rhubarb. Emily smiled and said thank you. Mark didn't say much at all. They kept to themselves, Helen said. But so do most people in Madison County. For the first few weeks, the windows were always open. At night, you could hear music drifting across the fields, old records, sometimes jazz, sometimes Motown. Emily's laugh light bubbling occasionally broke through the crickets. Mark built garden beds, painted the shed, installed new fencing around the barn even though they didn't have livestock. They looked happy. Or maybe they were trying to be. But by mid-July, something shifted. The music stopped. The laughter faded. Windows stayed closed, even when it was hot. Helen noticed the curtains were always drawn. Mark started driving into town less. Emily no longer waved from the mailbox. Then, one morning in late August, the Andersons simply weren't there. No goodbye. No moving truck. No for sale sign. Just silence. The garden lay untended. A package sat unclaimed on the porch. And behind one cracked window, a lamp flickered for 3 nights before finally going dark. Days turned into weeks. Then months. Eventually, the rumors started. Some said they were criminals on the run. Others whispered about a fight. There were theories about cults, aliens, government agents, all the usual suspects in rural folklore. But no one filed a missing persons report. No investigation. No press. No flyers on utility poles. Nothing. It was as if Emily and Mark had never existed. Years passed. The farmhouse decayed. Shingles fell off. Weeds swallowed the fence. Teenagers dared each other to sneak in on Halloween nights, swearing they heard footsteps upstairs or smelled perfume where no one had walked in years. But mostly, the house just sat blank, watching. Until 2023. That's when Alice Wren showed up. She wasn't from around here, a retired art teacher from Cedar Rapids, widowed 3 years prior. She'd seen the listing online and said something about the house drew her in. Maybe it was the price. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was something else entirely. She paid cash. No inspection. Alice moved in the week after Thanksgiving. And from the moment she crossed the threshold, she said she felt it a heaviness in the air, like static just before a storm. Still, she unpacked, cleaned, repainted the living room, repaired the front porch. Her plan was to restore the house slowly, room by room. Turn it into something warm, something beautiful again. But then came the attic. It was the 3rd week of December when she climbed the stairs behind the bedroom closet, a hidden panel barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. The wood groaned underfoot as she stepped into the low, dusty space. Spiderwebs hung like curtains. The only light came from a rusted skylight that barely let in the gray winter morning. She wasn't expecting to find anything. Maybe some old Christmas decorations. A broken fan. Leftovers from owners past. But near the far corner, under a ripped tarp and layers of blown insulation, she found a box. A wooden box, about 2 feet long, hinged, untouched by water or mold, wrapped in what looked like ivory silk. She opened it slowly. Inside was a wedding bouquet. Roses, lilies, dried lavender, all yellowed with age, but still intact, wrapped in a ribbon that had once been white, and tied around the ribbon was a tag. On it, written in faded ink, were 2 words. For Emily. Alice didn't understand at first. She thought it was sentimental, maybe left behind by someone else, but when she mentioned it to the local hardware store clerk, an old man named Gus, he paled. "You bought the Anderson house?" he asked. She nodded. "The ones who disappeared?" She froze. That night, Alice couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room, Bouquet on the table, searching online for anything: names, addresses, records. It was like trying to chase a ghost through fog. No news articles, no missing reports. Nothing. Except one real estate transaction from 2004, a property deed transferring ownership to Mark and Emily Anderson. No forwarding address, no resale record, just a flat line after 2005. She stared at the bouquet. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a message. Low, distant piano underscores silence. And in that moment, Alice made a decision. She would find out what happened in this house. Who these people were. Why they vanished. And what, if anything, had been left behind to be heard. Because some houses don't just hold memories. They hold confessions. She had always wanted something quieter. That's what Emily told herself every time she walked past their apartment window in Des Moines and looked out at the endless parade of brake lights and commuter haze. The city had felt like the right place when she was 24, vibrant, loud, full of new faces and stories. But after 5 years of vet clinic shifts, evenings spent microwaving leftovers, and weekends drowned in errands, the romance of it all had long since faded. Mark wasn't so sure. He liked structure. Noise didn't bother him. He worked best in it. But Emily's weariness was deepening. She wasn't sleeping. Her laugh, the thing he'd loved most about her, had become less frequent, sometimes replaced with silence, sometimes with staring. They weren't broken, not yet. But they were unglued slowly, softly, like wallpaper curling in the corners when no one's looking. Then came the listing. A real estate post from a site neither of them had ever heard of. A 3-bedroom farmhouse, 11 acres, detached barn, stone chimney. The price was absurd, low enough to feel suspicious, but high enough to wonder if it was just overlooked. It was Mark who first said it out loud. "What if we left?" Emily had stared at him like he'd read her thoughts. 2 months later, they were driving south, their belongings split between a U-Haul and Mark's truck. The sky was overcast. Emily had one hand out the window, feeling the wind trace her skin like a promise. She hummed quietly to a cassette she found buried in a box, something from their wedding reception, still intact. They reached Madison County just before sunset. The directions led them off a paved road and onto a winding gravel stretch lined with overgrown hedges and old wooden fences. The farmhouse appeared at the crest of a hill, whitewashed, 2 stories, pitched roof, wrap-around porch sagging slightly at the left corner. Emily stepped out first. There was a stillness to the place. Not the eerie kind. The kind that makes you inhale deeper. Birds chirped. A dog barked somewhere far away. A gust of wind rustled the grass but didn't move the trees. She smiled. Mark, trailing behind her, held a clipboard. Mortgage info. Zoning documents. Transfer of deed. He was less poetic about it. The house needed work, sure. The porch creaked. The back door stuck. The attic panel was crooked. But they saw it as something they could fix. A project. A reason to collaborate again. That first week was golden. Emily unpacked their kitchen 1 spoon at a time, humming old tunes as sunlight spilled across the counters. She planted daffodils near the barn. Mark set up his desk near the window, close enough to hear her voice drifting in through the glass. Nights were even better. They ate dinners on the floor, backs against the wall, sipping boxed wine and pretending they were pioneers. Emily read aloud from an old travel journal she'd found in a thrift store. Mark laughed when she added voices to the characters. It felt like rediscovering each other, not just as husband and wife, but as co-conspirators in something hopeful. She started keeping a journal again. It wasn't fancy, just a lined notebook she found while packing. Her first entry was short. May 9th. We're here. The floor slants in the bedroom and the water smells like pennies, but it's ours. I haven't felt this kind of quiet in years. There was a warmth to the early entries. Notes about weather, recipes she was trying, how Mark finally fixed the fence after 3 failed trips to town, how she couldn't sleep the first few nights because it was too quiet. The 12th of June. The stars here feel like they're closer, like they know your name. But gradually the tone shifted. By mid-July, the entries grew shorter, terser. The 3rd of July, Mark stayed up late again. Says he's working, but I don't hear typing, just silence. The 14th of July, he's been going into town less. Says people are nosy. I tried to ask what he meant. He changed the subject. The 21st of July, woke up to find him outside at 2 standing there. Said he couldn't sleep. Emily didn't say anything to friends. She and Claire had talked less since the move. Claire had warned her, gently, that isolation could do things to a marriage, especially one that was already fraying. Emily had smiled and said she wasn't afraid of distance. But fear doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up in the way you pause before opening a door, or how you start locking the bathroom even when you're alone. Her last journal entry was dated the 9th of August. Mark came home late again. Said he was at the feed supply store, but his hands smelled like oil. There was something in his pocket, I asked. He said nothing. I don't know. I feel like this house has started whispering. She never wrote again. The next day, she left a voicemail. 15 seconds. No greeting. Just a strained voice, brittle, shaking. Claire. This is not who I thought. Something's off. Please don't come here tonight. Please. Just wait. I'll... Click. Claire didn't hear it until the next morning. Her phone had died. When she tried to call back, there was no answer. She told herself it was a misunderstanding, that Emily would explain it all, that maybe it was about stress, or money, or some small argument blown out of proportion. She never called the police. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when her 3rd voicemail went unanswered and her birthday card came back unopened, that the pit in her stomach began to harden. But what do you do when someone hasn't asked for help? When there are no signs of a crime, no blood, no screams? You wait, you hope, and then you bury it, because life moves on and there are errands and bills and jobs. Claire kept the voicemail. She never played it again. Not until 18 years later, in a sunlit farmhouse now occupied by a woman named Alice. And when she heard it again, every hair on her body stood on end. She remembered the day she and Emily picked out wedding ribbons. How Emily had chosen ivory because it was soft and honest, like the kind of love she wanted. That same ribbon now wrapped the dried bouquet sitting between them. Claire looked at Alice, then back at the flowers. She was holding these, she said, her voice catching. The day she moved in. Alice didn't speak. She didn't have to, because something was wrong in that house. And the house remembered. Mark had said very little in those early days. People chalked it up to shyness. He kept to himself in town, didn't linger at the post office, avoided the co-op. But someone had seen him at a construction supply yard outside of Missouri in a different truck under a different name. He paid cash. When police later pulled his bank records, what little was left of them, they found a large cash withdrawal in July 2005. The kind of transaction people make when they don't intend to be found. But the question wasn't just where he went. It was what or who he left behind. Neighbors said they thought they'd heard arguing, that the porch light had been left on for days, that a dog barked continuously one night only to stop abruptly. No one had investigated. No one had knocked. By the time someone did years later, on Alice's behalf there was only dust, silence, and the faint scent of dried lavender behind the attic wall. There was a wedding bouquet, a name, and a silence that had lasted far too long. The wind in Madison County had a way of sounding like whispers if you listened too long, especially at night, especially near Old Mill Road. In the years after the Andersons vanished, the farmhouse was swallowed back into the land like something the earth regretted offering. Grass grew taller around its base. Ivy crept up the porch rails like veins. The barn door, unlatched and swaying in the breeze, groaned with every shift in weather. A place with no life yet never quite dead. People noticed, but said nothing. A town like that doesn't ask questions. It isn't ready to answer. The official story was simple. They moved away. A note had never been found, but no mail ever came. The mailbox remained rusted shut, and the lights never turned on again. 18 years. The silence wasn't loud, but it was constant like a hum in the walls, like breath you only notice once it's gone. Teenagers dared each other to walk the porch on Halloween nights. One kid swore he saw a woman in the upstairs window. Another claimed he found an old shoe in the barn, child-sized, even though the Andersons had no children. None of it was ever confirmed. None of it ever went further than whispers exchanged in the back of school buses and during bonfires. No official reports, no articles. The town just forgot. But not everyone. Sheriff Bill Hargrove remembered. He'd been a deputy back in 2005, young, inexperienced, and quick to assume the world was far simpler than it was. He remembered seeing the Andersons once at a 4th of July fireworks stand. Emily had smiled. Mark hadn't. Bill noticed her flinch when he placed a hand on her back. He told himself it was nothing. That couple's had bad nights. But now, looking at that dried bouquet on Alice's kitchen table, he realized what he hadn't wanted to admit. Back then, something had felt wrong. Not loud, just off. Like a note slightly out of tune, but still inside the melody. Alice handed him the box she'd found it in. He held it like it might fall apart. When she pointed to the silk lining, he noticed faint indentations like something else had once shared the space beside the flowers. "Did you find anything else?" he asked. Alice hesitated. Only dust. Later, she would remember she hadn't actually looked beneath the attic floorboards. But Bill had already made his call. Not to his current deputies, to someone else. Claire. She arrived that same evening, her hair shorter now, streaked with gray, but her posture still upright. She hadn't been back inside the farmhouse since the week after Emily disappeared. Her hands trembled as she stepped onto the porch. "She was in that window," Claire whispered, pointing to the upper left. "She waved to me the day they moved in. She looked, lit from within." Inside, the air still smelled of wood rot and insulation. Bill guided her to the table, to the bouquet. Claire didn't touch it at first, just looked, then closed her eyes. "She called me," she said. "That night, I didn't pick up." Bill waited. "I saved the voicemail. For years, I didn't listen. Then, I did. Once, it didn't say much, just fear. Her voice wasn't hers." Alice brought the recorder she had used to digitize the tape. Claire pressed play. The voice that emerged was brittle, rushed, like it was fighting time. "Claire, he's not who I thought. Something's off. Please don't come here tonight. Please, just wait. I'll—" Click. No one spoke for nearly a minute after it ended. Bill looked toward the stairs. "We need to check the rest of the house," he said. They began in the basement. The walls were stone and bowed inward slightly. Not from water damage, but age. A pile of firewood lay untouched beside a rusted furnace. A few jars of canned peaches sat on a shelf, their labels faded beyond recognition. Nothing stood out. Then came the crawl space. Alice had never gone down there. She said it felt wrong. Bad air, she claimed, cold even in summer. She left the door shut and sealed. But Bill opened it now. Inside, the flashlight beam cut through cobwebs thick enough to drape over furniture. Rodent droppings lined the floor. One wooden crate sat in the corner, half buried under insulation. Inside there was nothing but a rusted trowel and a handful of nails. He stood, brushing off his jacket, then paused. A nail in the wall was bent sideways. Not by age, by force, the kind of thing that happens when something is hung, then yanked. He didn't say anything. Not yet. They moved next to the barn. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The barn had collapsed partially on the west side, but one door still swung free. Inside, dust hung in the air like it was suspended in syrup. There were tools, broken equipment, a stack of lumber, and one dusty mattress rolled tightly in plastic. Claire saw it first. That wasn't here before. Alice shook her head. I didn't touch anything in here. Thanks. Bill stepped forward, peeled back the plastic. It was stained, mold at the corners. But no blood, no hair, nothing useful. But underneath the pallet, that had held it up. A carving. Just one letter. E, burned into the wood with something heated. Not a signature. A memory. That night, Bill made a decision. He returned to the sheriff's office, pulled the old file thin as a grocery receipt. No formal complaint. Just one report of concern filed by Claire. Dismissed within 48 hours. But it included one note. Claire suspects domestic strain. Recommends wellness check. Caller does not request further action. He remembered the call now. She had sounded tired, unsure. The kind of woman who wanted to say more, but didn't know if she had the right. He called her the next morning. You did ask, he said, and we didn't listen. She didn't answer. That week, Bill pulled land records. The Andersons had paid in full, no mortgage. But something stood out. The property was paid through a trust account connected to an address in Springfield, Missouri. He drove there himself. The building was no longer a bank, now a vape shop. But public records listed a transfer from a shell company registered under a name, Henry Carson. The photograph on file matched Mark Anderson. Hair longer, beard thicker. But it was him. Back in Madison County, Claire returned to the farmhouse one more time. She wandered the upstairs hallway, trailing her fingers along the walls, as if trying to feel what Emily last touched. The bedroom door was still missing its latch, something Emily had written about in her journal. Mark says he'll fix it tomorrow, she had once penned, but tomorrow never seems to come. In the closet, Claire noticed something strange. The floorboard beneath her foot shifted. Not enough to notice, unless you knew the space well. She knelt, pried it loose with a screwdriver. Beneath it, folded in a Ziploc bag, was a page. It was torn from a notebook, written in the same looping script as Emily's journal. If anything happens to me, he's not who you think he is. Tell Claire. I'm sorry. She read it 3 times before calling Bill. When he arrived, she handed it to him without a word. By the following week, Bill had filed for federal assistance. DNA samples from the attic, the barn, the crawl space. Comparison with familial records. A match was found. The ribbon on the bouquet contained hair belonging to Emily Anderson. They still hadn't found a body. But the house had begun to speak. And someone, finally, was listening. The bouquet sat in a sealed evidence bag now, labeled and numbered, tucked inside a manila folder that seemed too ordinary for what it carried. Behind its plastic sheen, the flowers looked more delicate than ever. Brittle, pale, suspended in time. 18 years had pressed them into silence, but somehow they still spoke. Claire kept glancing at it during her interview with the forensic officer. Her hands trembled slightly, though her voice remained clear. She described Emily's handwriting, her tone, the way she tilted her head when nervous. Every detail she could summon from a friendship interrupted by fear and unfinished words. Meanwhile, Alice stood in the background of the sheriff's office, watching a printer spit out form after form. Property records, missing persons lists, marriage certificates. A paper trail meant to give structure to something that never had any. Then came the journal. They found it tucked in a hollow behind the attic wall, behind one of the old cedar beams. Alice hadn't noticed it at first. It blended in with the dust and cobwebs. But a sliver of leather binding caught the light one afternoon as she cleared insulation. She reached for it with gloved hands, expecting maybe a manual or old ledger. Instead, she pulled out a weathered, cracked brown notebook. Inside, the writing started light, like a woman rediscovering herself. The early pages mirrored the ones Claire had seen in the original journal. Small triumphs, long walks, pie recipes. Emily wrote like someone hopeful, like someone willing to give life another chance. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The 30th of June, Mark says we're being watched. I told him it's just the neighbors. He says they're not who they say they are. He's changed the locks twice this week. The 5th of July found Mark burning a shoebox behind the barn. Wouldn't tell me what was in it. He looked at me like I wasn't me, like I was someone else. The 16th of July, he hasn't touched me in weeks. Sleeps facing the wall. Keeps a phone I've never seen before in the glove box. The 19th of July, I found a bag under the bed. Money, IDs, keys, none of them ours. The final page wasn't dated. If I disappear, I want someone to know this wasn't an accident, this wasn't a choice, this was him. Claire read it first, then Bill, then the State Crime Lab. The writing was confirmed. The ink was aged. There were fingerprints most belonging to Emily, but one partial match to Mark. It was enough to officially open a homicide investigation. Media coverage came next, slow at first. A small article in the Des Moines Register sparked curiosity. By the end of the week, a reporter from Cedar Rapids picked it up. Farmhouse mystery reopened after 18 years. It made the evening news. Neighbors started to talk again. Some claimed they'd always suspected something. Others said nothing at all. Bill kept the case low to the ground. No cameras, no press conferences. Just slow, methodical work. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected place. An old cashier named Louise had worked part-time at the corner store back in 2005. She remembered Mark. Said he came in once or twice a week, always around dusk. Bought the same things. Coffee, batteries, duct tape. On his last visit, he looked different. Sweaty, jumpy. He paid in cash. His hands shook when he reached for change. I told him to take care, Louise said. He looked at me and said, "You don't know what that means anymore." Gave me chills. Never saw him again. The surveillance footage was long gone, but the memory stuck. Bill sent a search team back to the farmhouse. This time, they brought ground-penetrating radar. The garden behind the barn had long since been overtaken by weeds, but beneath the soil, about 4 feet down, the radar caught something unnatural, a disruption in the earth consistent with prior excavation. They marked the spot, dug carefully. By sunset, they had uncovered cloth, lace, a piece of fabric off-white, yellowed by time, but unmistakably part of a wedding dress. They paused, waited for the forensic team. A tent was erected, lights were brought in. When the soil gave way to bone, no one said a word. The remains were curled, as if placed intentionally. A ring still clung to the left-hand gold, simple engraved on the inside. E and M 2004. On. The body was confirmed to be Emily Anderson. A post-mortem report would later confirm fractured skull, defensive wounds, a blow to the back of the head, no animal activity, no accidental fall, no misunderstanding. It was murder. Claire sat alone in her car when Bill told her. She stared straight ahead, hands folded in her lap. "She was right," she whispered. All this time, she was right. Mark Anderson was now the primary suspect in an active homicide case, but finding him was another matter. He hadn't used his real name in years. No credit cards, no known addresses. But one of the IDs Emily had found, the ones described in her journal, led to a paper trail. A small storage unit in Kansas City had been paid in cash for over a decade. It took 2 warrants and 3 weeks to gain access. Inside was a single duffel bag. Inside the bag, clothing, a burner phone, old receipts. One document stood out, a truck registration in Arizona under the name David Wren. Alice stared at the name for a long time. "Wren," she said. "That's my name." Bill looked at her. "I took my husband's name in 1986, she said quietly. "Wren wasn't mine." They ran the Arizona plates. The truck was registered to a house in a suburb outside Flagstaff, a quiet cul-de-sac family neighborhood. A man named David Wren owned the property, had a wife, 2 kids, and a job at a car parts distribution warehouse. He looked ordinary. But when they pulled the driver's license photo and matched it against Mark Anderson's marriage license from 2004, it was undeniable. It was him, living a second life. A second wife, 2 children. Bill flew out the next morning with 2 U.S. Marshals. The arrest was quiet. At 6:42 a.m., Mark, now David, stepped outside to take out the trash. When they placed the cuffs on him, he didn't speak, didn't resist, just stared at the ground, nodding faintly. As they loaded him into the car, one of the marshals asked if there was anything he wanted to say. He looked up, his voice barely audible. She wasn't supposed to find the box. At the farmhouse, Alice stood in the attic once more, the wind brushing against the rafters like a memory. She placed the journal back where it had been found, then paused. There, behind the beam, hidden beneath old cloth, was something else small, almost forgotten. A silver locket. Inside, a photograph, Emily, smiling, eyes bright. A note behind it. For whoever finds this, if you're reading, you cared enough to look. Thank you. Please let them know I didn't run. I loved him once. But I didn't run. Alice closed the locket, tears lining her eyes. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, warming the porch rail just enough to make the ivy glisten. And for the first time, in nearly 2 decades, the house felt lighter. Like maybe, finally, it could breathe again. The courtroom was colder than anyone expected. Not physically, the thermostat read 73. But there was something sterile in the air, something mechanical and bloodless, as though justice here had traded emotion for protocol. Mark Anderson sat at the defense table in a pressed gray suit, hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was pale, older, but not unrecognizable. The boyish charm from his wedding photo was gone, worn down into something harder, quieter. His hair was trimmed neatly, parted too cleanly. His posture stiff, too stiff, like someone playing a role they didn't audition for. In the gallery, Claire sat 3 rows back, alone. The only face from Emily's life still present. Alice was there too, sitting in the far corner, fingers curled in her lap. She hadn't spoken to reporters, hadn't accepted the interviews. But she had stayed in the house, in the story, long enough to see it through. The prosecutor began with the evidence. The bouquet, the journal, the remains. The ribbon, still knotted tightly after 18 years. The handwriting verified. The fingerprint partials cross-checked. The duffel bag, the false IDs. The voice on the voicemail. Emily's last words. Each fact was delivered plainly, as though their weight did not require emphasis. But Claire felt every one of them. Like stones dropped into water, rippling outward, washing over the years she had spent convincing herself that silence was safety. The defense didn't deny that Emily was dead. But they suggested the timing couldn't be proven, that perhaps she'd fallen, perhaps Mark had panicked, that 18 years blurred memory, blurred motive, that maybe, just maybe, someone else had been there. But then came the voicemail, played aloud in court. Claire, this is not who I thought. Something's off. Please, don't come here tonight. Please, just wait. I'll... Silence followed. Not a breath in the room. Then the journal. Emily's handwriting, her words read aloud by a forensic linguist who specialized in victim documentation. He's changed the locks twice this week. Burning a shoebox behind the barn. A phone I've never seen before. IDs, keys, none of them ours. If I disappear, this wasn't an accident. The prosecutor paused. She wrote this weeks before she died, and she placed it under the floor where she hoped someone would one day find it. That someone did. Mark never looked up. His lawyer objected when the state moved to admit the locket as emotional evidence. The judge allowed it. Claire hadn't known about the photo inside it, showed Emily in front of the barn, sunlight in her hair, a blur of green fields behind her. She wore a white button-down shirt, no makeup, just freckles. Just honesty. The back of the photograph was inscribed in pencil. The 2nd of July, 2005. First day I really felt home. Claire closed her eyes. She remembered that summer. Remembered Emily's laugh through the phone, short, unguarded. A sound she hadn't heard since. The trial lasted 10 days. On the 9th, Mark finally spoke. Not much. Just enough to be quoted, enough to haunt. The prosecutor asked why he left. He hesitated, then said flatly, "She wouldn't stop asking questions." "And what kind of questions?" the attorney pushed. Mark blinked slowly. "Questions about who I was before." A murmur spread through the gallery. The judge banged the gavel, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. He had admitted it, not in full, not with detail, but enough to dissolve the last thread of doubt. Claire stood outside the courthouse when the verdict came down. Guilty. Second-degree murder. 25 years to life. No parole for 20. She didn't cry. Not then. Not until later that night, back in the farmhouse, standing in the hallway where Emily's wedding photo now hung centered on the wall, framed simply next to the bouquet preserved in glass. Alice had insisted it stay there. Not as decoration. As a declaration. This was Emily's home. And now it remembered her properly. Bill Hargrove retired a month later, said he'd waited too long to listen the first time, didn't want to make that mistake again. Before leaving office, he held a press conference. Brief. No flair. He held up a photo of the bouquet. "This," he said, "is what brought us back. A handful of dried flowers. That's all it took to remind us. A woman lived, loved, fought, and died." Claire stood beside him, said nothing, just nodded. Later, reporters would call the case the Farmhouse Widow Mystery. Podcasts picked it up. A documentary crew showed up, though Alice refused to let them inside. She said the house had done enough talking. Instead, she kept restoring it, one room at a time. The bedroom, the barn, the porch. She planted daffodils again, and lavender, Emily's favorite. Sometimes Claire visited. They'd sit on the steps in silence, not needing to speak. One autumn evening, Claire brought a small box. Inside was a cassette. The voicemail, digitized but untouched. Alice looked at it, then nodded. They buried it beneath the daffodils in a sealed jar beside a note that read, "In case anyone forgets she was here." And she mattered. The sun dipped below the trees. The wind rustled through the stalks. Somewhere in the distance, a barn creaked. And in that stillness, for the first time in a long time, there was peace. The news broke in Arizona 3 days after the verdict. The headline was simple, almost surgical in tone. Flagstaff man convicted in Iowa cold case murder. Underneath it, a cropped photo of Mark, or rather David Wren, walking out of a courtroom, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. His wife, the second one, found out from the article before she heard it from the police. She had been grocery shopping when her phone lit up with messages, friends, neighbors, co-workers, all asking if it was true. She said nothing. Paid for her bread and eggs, walked to her car, Saturday behind the wheel for an hour without turning the engine on. The man she had married, the father of her children, wasn't David Wren. Never was. He was a ghost in disguise. A man who had built a new life atop a grave. The next day, she brought their children to her sister's house. She told them their father had done something very bad a long time ago. Her daughter cried. Her son asked if they'd ever see him again. She said no. Back in Iowa, the farmhouse sat quiet. Restored now, piece by piece. Alice had finished refinishing the floors, warm chestnut stained and sealed, each plank sanded by hand. She said it felt like giving the house its breath back. She didn't mind the solitude. Every so often someone would stop by. A former neighbor, a curious local. Once even a college student writing a thesis on unsolved cases solved by physical evidence. But mostly, it was just her. And the sound of the wind returning. Claire visited often. She brought coffee. Old stories, new silence. There was an ease between them now. Not friendship exactly, but kinship. The kind that's born not from shared joy, but from shared loss. One afternoon, while sorting through a trunk in the cellar, Alice found a bundle of papers wrapped in plastic. Inside, a receipt book from 2005. And a letter, never mailed, unaddressed. Just one line on the front in Emily's handwriting, to whoever comes next. Alice read it aloud to Claire that evening. This house is older than its wood. It remembers. And if you feel strange here, don't ignore it. Listen, sometimes I think houses know when they're being lied to. If you're reading this, maybe the truth has finally come. Maybe someone listened. If they did, thank you. I wanted to live here. I wanted peace, but something followed us. And I think I always knew it wouldn't leave quietly. Neither woman spoke for a while. Claire eventually reached over, took the letter, and folded it neatly. She knew she wouldn't get out, she said, but she wanted someone else to. Bill stopped by once more, before his retirement became official. He brought a small wooden box. Inside was Emily's locket. He had it cleaned. The photo restored, the clasp repaired. I think it belongs here, he said. Alice nodded. They hung it in the hallway, beside the preserved bouquet, beneath the journal page framed in glass. A shrine, but not one of grief of witness. Meanwhile, in prison, Mark remained silent. He spoke to no one, refused visitors, did not appeal. One reporter tried to interview him. He declined. But his second wife, the one he left behind, eventually agreed to speak. She didn't want cameras, only audio. She said the hardest part wasn't the betrayal, it was the silence. He was always a little quiet, she said, but I never thought he was hiding. I thought he was just measured, controlled. End. She recalled a moment, a night in 2010. Their son was sick, and she couldn't find Mark anywhere in the house. She eventually found him in the garage, sitting in the dark, staring at the floor. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "Just thinking." When pressed, he added, "About what came before." She assumed he meant his first job, his childhood, something long past and harmless. She never imagined it was murder. Claire listened to the interview weeks later on her porch, earphones tucked in tightly. At one point, the woman said, "I think he loved me, but I don't know which version of him loved me." Claire closed her eyes. Because she understood that. Because Emily probably wondered the same. Back inside, Alice worked on a new project, a memory wall in the guest room. Not for Emily, for others. She called it The Unspoken. Photos of other women who had vanished. Stories she had clipped from newspapers. Cases without answers. Lives without justice. She wrote each name in careful script and mounted them beside a small votive light. One by one. Not to solve them. Just to remember. One evening, Claire brought over something she had kept hidden for years, a cassette tape, the original, the voicemail. She placed it gently beside the flowers and the journal and the locket. Then she said something that made Alice freeze. "I dreamed about her," Claire said. "Last week. First time in years." Alice waited. She was in the kitchen, barefoot, laughing, cooking something. It smelled like cinnamon. She looked happy. What did she say? She didn't. She just turned, looked at me, and smiled. Alice didn't reply. But that night, as she walked through the house before bed, she thought she smelled cinnamon, too. The air wasn't cold anymore. Not in that way. Outside, the fields turned gold as autumn deepened. Leaves fell in slow motion. The barn stood strong again, its door repaired, the roof patched. And inside, the light filtered through the old skylight in the attic, striking the place where the box had once been hidden. There was no more darkness there. Just space. Just breath. Just memory. It was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. No return address. No stamp. Just hand-delivered in a plain envelope left between the screen door and the latch. Alice found it when she came back from the feed store. Her first instinct was junk mail, another donation ask, or a political flyer, but the envelope was unmarked, smooth, slightly yellowed, like paper aged by time more than weather. Inside, one page, folded twice. She opened it carefully, expecting nothing. But the first line stopped her cold. "You don't know me, but I knew Emily. Not well, once, in 1997. The handwriting was heavy, deliberate, a man's hand." It continued. "We met at a diner in Council Bluffs. She was passing through, on a bus, heading east. I never forgot her. She talked about freedom like it was a place you could live." Alice sat down slowly. I saw her picture in the article. Took me a while to be sure, but it's her. She had this way of holding a coffee mug, both hands wrapped around it, like it was the only warm thing left in the world. She said she didn't trust people who smiled too much. Said sometimes silence is safer. I wanted to say I'm sorry, that I wasn't the kind of man who knew how to listen then, that I remember her, and I always will. No signature. Just 3 initials. Rhett. Alice placed the letter beside the others, the box she'd begun to keep. Clippings. Messages. Printouts from people who'd written after reading the story. Each one tethered to a memory of Emily that had survived the years, scattered like wildflower seeds waiting for wind. Claire called that evening. She'd seen the same article. But what caught her wasn't the story. It was the photo used at the bottom. A cropped scan of Emily's journal. 1 line. Sometimes I think houses know when they're being lied to. Claire said she hadn't seen it since the trial. She'd forgotten how true it still felt. Because the truth now had become something more than evidence. It had become presence. It was in the way the windows didn't stick anymore. In the way the floor didn't groan as loudly at night. In the way the wind blew through the curtains just enough to make them dance, but never loud enough to sound like voices. The house was breathing again. But outside it, in town, online, beyond the world, had begun to pick at Mark's second life. Investigators retraced every step. The day he left Iowa, he drove west. Changed plates outside Kansas City. Slept in his truck for 3 nights. Shaved his beard. Bought new clothes. Opened a bank account under the name David Wren using forged credentials found in a duffel bag he had prepared months earlier. He applied for jobs in 3 states before landing in Flagstaff. The man who arrived in Arizona was calm, organized, courteous. He volunteered, donated to church drives, taught his daughter to fish. But he never mentioned Iowa. Never said the name Emily. In interviews, his second wife said she always felt there was a lockbox inside him, something she wasn't supposed to open. She asked once about his past, about family. He said, "We lost touch. I wasn't worth remembering." She never asked again. That silence had protected him. But it hadn't erased the guilt, because investigators found something else. Inside the storage unit in Kansas City, in a file beneath utility receipts and faded maps, was a photograph. It was grainy, bent at the corners, but unmistakable. Emily, asleep on the porch of the farmhouse, a blanket over her shoulders, a mug in her hands, taken from the upstairs window. The timestamp on the back, the 22nd of July, 2005, 3 weeks before she disappeared, and scrawled beneath it barely legible. Some things you don't bury, they follow. For the first time, prosecutors considered petitioning for a higher charge, first-degree premeditation. But ultimately, they left the conviction intact. Life in prison was life. He would be in a cell, and yet something still felt unresolved. Alice knew it. Claire knew it too. Because justice is not the same as clarity. You can have one without the other. So, one morning in November, just as Frost returned to the fields, Claire asked to walk through the farmhouse alone. Alice agreed. She made tea. Left the door open, Claire wandered from room to room, touching old banisters, tracing door frames with her fingertips. She paused at the hallway mirror, the same one Emily had hung, its edges chipped from the move. She looked at herself. Then at the faint outline of something behind her, not a person, but a presence. Light filtering in just right, as though someone had once stood there and the air still remembered the shape. She turned. There was nothing, just a photo of Emily on the wall. And yet, Claire smiled. Not out of comfort, out of recognition, because some absences take up space. They breathe when you breathe. They fill a room long after it's empty. Outside, the barn stood still. The daffodils had wilted back into the soil. The porch creaked under the weight of time again. But this time, the creaking didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like settling, like memory putting down roots, like a house that knew after so many years it had finally been heard. Winter came quietly that year. No storm. No sudden drop. Just cold mornings that thickened with silence. Frost gathering on the fence posts. Breath hanging in the air like questions that never got asked. Alice had lived in the farmhouse for just over a year now, and she still didn't know how to describe it when people asked. She would pause, searching for the right phrase, but nothing ever felt right. "It's peaceful," she sometimes said. But peace wasn't quite the word. There were days when the wind whistled through the attic vents just loud enough to feel like it was saying something. Mornings when she'd wake up and swear she'd just heard footsteps on the stairs, the old boards shifting, the air expanding, a kind of echo with no source. But it didn't feel menacing. It felt like presence. Claire came by on the first day of snow. She brought soup, a loaf of bread, and a box she hadn't opened in 18 years. Inside were photos, real ones, taken with film, glossy, slightly warped by time. There was one of Emily and Mark in front of a moving truck. Another of Emily laughing as she tried to balance a watering can with one hand and swat away bees with the other. They were snapshots of a time before anyone knew what was coming. Alice studied each image like they were maps to a place she'd only ever read about, a place both real and irretrievable. They pinned the photos on a corkboard in the study, not as an altar, but as a reminder. Emily had lived, not just died. The narrative in the media had narrowed over time. Tragic bride, forgotten victim, woman in the attic. But she was more than that. She was the one who'd painted the barn doors that pale sea green, the one who'd baked cinnamon bread even when it came out wrong, the one who'd scribbled poetry in margins and signed her name in lowercase letters. She was the one who'd wanted to begin again. And she had, for a while. Alice and Claire didn't speak much that afternoon. They didn't need to. They listened to the old wind-up radio Emily had kept in the pantry. It still worked mostly static, but enough melody to imagine a song. Claire tapped her fingers against her knee in rhythm. Alice watched the light shift across the kitchen tiles. It felt like a requiem and a hymn at the same time. A week later, a letter came from the Iowa State Victim Services Division. It was short. One paragraph. Mark Anderson had died in custody. Stroke. No foul play, no final statement. No one claimed the body. The state arranged for cremation. No ceremony. No flowers. Just paperwork. Claire read the letter twice, then folded it in half and slid it into the fireplace. It burned quickly, quietly, without fanfare. Alice didn't say anything. But that night she sat on the front steps longer than usual, watching snow fall in thin, diagonal sheets across the yard. It blanketed the earth evenly, the flower beds, the barn, the grave marker they'd placed under the elm tree with Emily's name carved by hand. There was no date of death, just the year she was found. And beneath it, she didn't run. She remembered. That phrase had stayed with them. Remembering, that was the act now. The offering. The resistance. They kept her name alive not through outrage or vengeance, but through the quiet act of naming, of telling, of not turning away. In early spring, the County Historical Society reached out. They wanted to document the case as part of a new exhibit. Unburied Truths, Cold Cases Reopened. They asked for a statement. Alice declined. But Claire wrote something. Just 2 sentences. She mattered when no one was watching. And she still does. They hung those words beneath the preserved bouquet, now displayed in a sealed shadow box with temperature control and ultraviolet filtering glass. People stood and stared at it longer than anyone expected. Some left notes beside it. One simply said, "I'm listening." Back at the farmhouse, Alice began teaching again. Small groups, writing workshops, creative journaling. Women from surrounding towns gathered in the living room once a week, sitting on floor cushions, notebooks in hand, pens scratching into silence. She didn't tell them the whole story. But the house did, in its own way. One woman asked about the photo in the hallway. "Is that your sister?" she asked. Alice smiled. "No," she said, "but I think she'd have liked that." The class continued. Words were shared. Some private, some aloud. One day, Claire read from a piece she had written but never planned to show anyone. It was about standing in the field after Emily's remains were found, about how the air felt heavier than usual, about how she wanted to scream but couldn't. I looked down, she read, and I saw her wedding band still on her hand. And I thought, she held on. Even after he didn't. She held on. Maybe that's what we're doing now. The room was silent. Then one woman whispered, "That's why we write." Later, Alice walked Claire out to her car. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. The wind had changed again, warmer now, scented with early blooms and distant soil. Before Claire got in, she turned. "You ever feel like she's still here?" she asked. Alice nodded. "Every day," she said. "But not like before, not as pain." Claire smiled. "As what, then?" Alice looked back at the house. "As memory," she said, "and as proof." The porch light flickered on as they parted. Inside, the radio played faintly in the kitchen. And in the attic, the air was still. Not empty. Just still. Like something that had finally been heard. And no longer needed to whisper.